Thanks for coming in.
Oh, I'll be back. Just running my
Oh,
dog for a
okay.
All right. I guess we'll just start with name, hometown.
Hi, yeah, Ted Dobson, 20-year resident of Sheffield.
Okay. Where you were born and what
Yeah.
brought you up here?
Yeah, I was born in Red Bank, New Jersey. I left home in Red Bank at 16, wound up going to school at Blair Academy in northwestern New Jersey. That was at the time still quite rural, surrounded by a number of farms, including vegetable farms that had been in operation for some time. And that certainly, that part of my life was connected with other parts of my life that piqued my curiosity about farming and growing food. Yeah, that started when I was quite young, actually.
How young exactly?
Well, yeah, when I was at Wanamassa School in 1967, there was still dairying and fruit farms at that time. A lot of it had been suburbanized. That part of New Jersey, central Jersey, the shore had been suburbanized with the advent of industry and corporations moving in. But, you know, there's a reason New Jersey's a garden state. It was a splendid place to grow food. It's where the confluence of southern atmosphere meets the north. So it's a classic mid-Atlantic state, you know, with more southern influence than northern influence, quite moderate climate, and the soils in New Jersey are splendid. I believe that it, for many millions of years, was under the ocean, so what was left behind was an incredibly fertile marine-based soil. So, long story short, New Jersey supplied Philadelphia and Manhattan for several centuries with their food needs. And that somehow got steeped into my psyche. It was helpful to have a grandfather that knew a bit of the history of Monmouth County. He had moved there in the 40s, so he had remembered 20 years later that Orchard Lane in a suburban development was actually an orchard. And he was a great storyteller, and I love to ask him questions. So there's no doubt that my interest in farming started at a very young age.
Okay. And what led you up to farming in Massachusetts instead of New Jersey?
Well, I wound up at the University of Santa Cruz, the UCSC Farm and Garden Project, which was at that time in 1980 one of the only programs in the United States that had an active curriculum in organic farming, specifically the French intensive biodynamic method that had been instigated by Alan Chadwick, a pupil of Rudolf Steiner's, who created the anthroposophical movement, the Waldorf schooling movement, the biodynamic farming movement. So my teacher was his pupil. So there was a kind of, you know, obviously direct lineage there. So this was like hyper-organic farming in a sense. And because Santa Cruz, the University of Santa Cruz, was quite a liberal college at its inception in '67, the professors knew of Chadwick. He was also a world-famous Shakespearean actor, and they were glad to have this mad eccentric on their campus creating orchards and bio-intensive farming techniques. No one had ever seen anything quite like it. So the privilege of getting into that program from 80 to 82 really turned me into a very thoughtful young horticulturist. I knew I wanted to become a professional farmer when I left the program. The question was where to go. My family had bought a place in Hillsdale in 1972. We loved to ski. Catamount was right nearby, ski mountain. And my dad and his brother and sister renovated a very old barn into a home. it burned down in 1977. So by the time I left Santa Cruz in the spring of '83, I had arranged with my father to go back to that land and make a go of it.
Okay. In Massachusetts.
In New York, just over the border
Okay.
here. So Hillsdale, New York is, as we sit here in Sheffield, is about 10 minutes due west of here. So I've been in this region now for the better part of 40 years.
Mm-hmm. And when we first started talking about farming, you told me the story about going to Egypt when you were really young and what you learned from there. Do you want to talk about that really quick and how that influenced where you're at now as a farmer? Because I think that's a really interesting side of your story that not many people can relate to. But
yeah, so this has definitely been, however you want to parse out this word spiritual, the way I would parse it out is feeling like you have a destiny in life. And prior to Egypt, this is after leaving high school prematurely in my junior year, I went to art school in Manhattan, stayed in Manhattan for 3 or 4 months. My mom opened a jazz club in St. Bart's, the Caribbean. I worked for her and in the jazz club for nearly a year. For various complicated reasons, that club was shut down. But I met jazz musicians from all over the world, one of whom, Armand Gordon, who was from Lausanne, Switzerland, invited me to come see him. And when I got to Switzerland, he wasn't there. His mother had fallen sick in Nice, France. And I arrived a week early, so I was on my own with about $40 a traveler's check. So I was forced to kind of make my way into a work life in Switzerland. So I started hiking through the countryside, and eventually I found work at a dairy and tobacco farm. And they had been growing tobacco on this farm in Moudon, Switzerland, for the better part of 200 years. I threw myself into it. They boarded me there. I also cleaned the cow stalls each day. I fed the rabbits. They were also a rabbit meat was something else they did there as well. But I worked hard enough there for a month that they basically set me up throughout Switzerland with jobs. So then I went from there to picking grapes to Saint-Sapharin, coincidentally just north of Lausanne, where I had started from. And after a month there, I walked to Geneva. I hiked everywhere through Switzerland. I got a farm on a job on an orchard picking apples and pears. So that must have been early October. And there were migrants from all over the world at this operation. There was a group of Egyptians. I was really fascinated with Islam. I didn't know anything about it, but my psychology, going on 18 at that point, I was very curious. So after that job ended and I'm 3 or 4 months into Switzerland, I have a bit of savings. I flew to Cairo with my new friend Mohammed. I wound up converting to Islam, going to the American University of Cairo. I'm not sure that's the exact name, but there was an American university in Cairo which I attended. And I learned rudimentary Arabic. That aside, one of my hobbies was I like to walk all over the city and find new mosques to pray in each day. Well, many of them were along the Nile, and to feed this teeming city, these ancient dhows would come into Cairo. I mean, they look like boats from 1,000 years ago, and I'm sure the design was at least that, but they'd be full of dates and sugar cane and produce. And I was so fascinated with this that I took a bus trip into the countryside and visited these villages along the Nile, and they were farming like it was centuries ago. But here they are supplying the cities and feeding the country of Egypt, you know. This was not commercial, commodified agriculture by any stretch of the imagination. If I think about it now, they were spreading manures, even their own. That probably was problematic. Thinking that one through right now. But nevertheless, it really touched me very, very deeply to see something that had been practiced agriculturally for so many centuries still translating. I think that probably touched me so deeply that I decided to leave Egypt after 9 months of being there and coming back to the States with a vision of pursuing an organic farming career. I had epiphany actually in a bookstore in Cairo. There was an English bookstore, been there for a long time, with a great poetry selection, and I remember reading poems from William Wordsworth, and when he was talking about the hills and dales, and of course he was speaking from an English point of view, I thought of Hillsdale, my dad, the farm there, and that's when I had some idea that that's where I'd wind up. Of course, this is several years prior to getting to Santa Cruz, so there were many non-linear paths that got me into all this. But you know, when you follow your heart, your passion, you never know how you're going to get to the destination.
Absolutely. And would you say you made it? Would you say you're still on the journey?
Well, you know, you always make it somewhere, but that's just a transitory place. It's like getting comfortable at a bus stop, right? So you've never made it. You know, I'd say that a lot of the ideas that have motivated me, I've worked very hard to make true in a time scheme. But as far as events in my life, what I've made is made things happen, work with a lot of great people to further grow the ideas. Obviously, they were their ideas too. So, you know, meeting the right people at the right time has been very fortunate in my life. So I'm still trying to, well, I wouldn't say make things happen, but live from the inside out, you know. And there's always practical steps involved in that.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's the best way you can go about it. So I'm going to get into the more farm-oriented questions.
Sure.
They're pretty basic ones. Why is farming important to you? I think we covered that one, actually. I think that one is pretty, unless you have like a shorter response, like you don't think you've covered.
Farming is fundamental to feeding ourselves. It's never been more important to think about farming. It's actually a great question. We're shifting from a commodity-orientated, large-scale, monocrop, petrochemical addiction to growing food to what we are now calling regenerative life into death patterns that complete the cycles of existence on micro, macro, and every hoop, if you will, in between. In other words, we're reinforcing the common sense facts of existence by growing a new regional agriculture that is more respectful of the land and insightful as to our own ecological survival within vast ecosystems that agriculture is one part of, i.e. that's how we feed ourselves. And you know, agriculture is also responsible in a large-scale sense to enormous carbon emissions. So building organic matter and building a future around food that is, quote, sustainable because it's based on regenerative principles has been the guiding motif of my life. And I think that people are waking up to that everywhere at this point in time, how critical food, fuel, and fiber from a regenerative point of view is outside of the current capitalistic paradigm.
Great. So you already went over most of your path to becoming a farmer. Do you have any tips for people who are considering the path?
Yeah, there are more and more organic regenerative farms popping up throughout the United States and the world. So there are endless opportunities and possibilities for any young person to save themselves, save each other, save the planet, and work with other species. So this is the guiding motif. You know, it's not just regenerative farming, it's about regenerating life. With all due respect, we have been a real pest over the last several centuries, and it seems to be coming to a head in the 21st century, and certainly 2020 is a chapter of many more to come this century. So I think it's a critical century to our species' survival, certainly not the planet that created us. You know, it's seen a lot of species come and go, but you know, being cognizant of the damage we've done, I think young people have a responsibility to examine how they imagine the future, a better future, and certainly organic and regenerative farming. Organic and regenerative, just about anything, is the future.
Yes. So within that, what would you say are the biggest challenges in your process of achieving that?
You know,
You could do that on a smaller scale,
my
like your own
challenges
personal.
are like anybody else's challenges in life. It's, you know, working with other people, always, you know, checking in with one's beliefs to see if there's proper flexibility there. Am I preventing more information from coming into my life? You know, being creative, this job gives you the opportunity to be very, very creative because you're working with life. And, you know, the garden ultimately teaches the gardener. It's not the other way around. The more you know, the more you don't know in this game. So one is always learning. So the challenge is to recognize that one has the opportunity to continually grow and learn.
What supports and resources were most valuable to you and your farming business in terms of grants, funds, agencies, organizations, and why?
Well, none of that really. I mean, honestly, it was marijuana. You know, I loved the plant. I just thought it was sick and absurd that one could go to a gas station and buy cigarettes and alcohol, as well as fill up your gas guzzling car. But a plant, marijuana, taken right, the flowers taken right from a branch, was a Schedule I drug. I thought it was sick, perverse, and I was going along with that. Plus the fact that I couldn't get bank loans as a young man. I had a little tiny bit of family money because I only did 2 years of college, so my dad put the rest of the money into funding getting a house built for us. But after that, we were on our own. And the only way I could really build out my farming career was having a cash crop. And it turns out that, you know, millions of people then, 37 years ago, and now, with legalization upon us, smoke pot. So just seemed like the right thing to do given I was growing plants. So that became my bank, my source of funding. When I started organic farming here in the Hudson River Valley and the Berkshires in the early 80s, there was no local agricultural left to speak of. There were commodity farmers, families that were in the dairy business, or Hudson River Valley orchards that were commercially, non-organically based. But there wasn't a local farm-to-table movement. None of that was going on. So, you know, I was on the first wave of all that and quite aware of it. It was quite an exciting time. You know, meeting chefs in Manhattan, and not long after in the Berkshires and Hudson River Valley, all these guys had been influenced by Alice Waters to one extent or another, West Coast cuisine. Of course, farm to table in California is natural. What can't you grow in California? The organic movement had been established there in the 70s, and it was in full flight, full gear, when I went to school in '83. There was quite a bit of organic farming going on in the state that really wasn't happening here in the Northeast. So to be one of the people that was on the ground floor of that definitely was a huge inspiration. So, you know, I couldn't find grants. There wasn't grants. There was, people thought you were a nut in the conventional world, doing organic farming. They thought it was archaic, that it ancestrally was something their grandparents did because they didn't have money for fertilizers or something. So a lot of education was involved in getting involved in food stores, and even meeting chefs that weren't necessarily aware of what organic growing even meant. So when I think back to that decade, there was a lot of education involved, and I was self-funded through how I just described.
Right. Okay. What are some key personal characteristics or personality traits you think would be useful for someone who is interested in working on a farm or in a farm-like environment?
Guts, courage. You know, you have to have the courage of your convictions. Farming is not an easy way to make a living. It's a passion first and foremost, and it doesn't easily fit into the capitalistic paradigm. You're not printing out widgets. You are working in a vast, complex system of nature and weather, nature. So there are a lot of contingencies that are completely, utterly out of your control. So you have to learn how to work with the unexpected, the uncertain, and one has to have a kind of courageous exuberance to embrace that. You know, we've been conditioned through our education and capitalism to think that there's some consistency and certainty in existence. And going through this time of COVID, what a bunch of bullshit. Life, there is no life without death. And that's the edge of courage, is understanding that you're a mortal creature in mortal time. So live your life as if today is your entire life, or at least that's the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When it comes to someone who just got their own farm and it's their first season growing, do you have any advice for them in terms of getting their crop and having a successful first season?
Well, good luck having a successful first season. I mean, your first season is just going to be utterly a learning experience and an experiment. And, you know, if you have some success, that's what you're going to ride on in terms of momentum. It's not about success or failure, ultimately. It's about embracing the process. And we've covered this, you know, one is constantly learning. And your first season is your first season, you know, and you'll know after your first season whether you're cut out for this work.
Mm-hmm.
The dream gets real in a hurry.
Yeah, it definitely does. What is something about farming that ended up being very different from your expectations? If you had any expectations going?
Oh, well, I think farming pot, actually, you know, I mean, that was definitely a dream, given I was ducking helicopters and, you know, looking over my shoulder nervously. Well, you know, when was the law going to be knocking on my door, parachuting in to airlift me out of my grow? That I lived with that kind of reality for some time. But, you know, in the back of my mind and in the forefront, I was always talking about legalization and somehow making plans for growing cannabis, particularly hemp, which I think will be the next wave of the cannabis revolution. We need to begin to address our fiber and fuel issues. Certainly from a fiber point of view, hemp has been vastly underrated. So that was always part of my program, not necessarily legal marijuana, but legal hemp. And I see that as part of my future. I'm not sure I answered your question, but you know, you have no way of knowing what's going to work or not. You have to continually adapt to the circumstances, and if you only have X amount of acres to work with, you're going to be challenged with what to grow, what the market, what your market is for what you're growing. And that's research a lot of young farmers don't do in advance. They just assume growing this, that, and the other might work out, and then they go out and look for a place to sell it. Well, that's ass backwards. Go out and do your homework, and then make an informed decision about what you're going to grow. So, in fact, it took me 2 years, to your question now, to figure that one out. You know, don't grow everything. Grow, yes, a great deal of diversity, feed yourself, of course, but grow crops that are going to allow you to make some kind of living.
Could you talk about any mistakes that you've made as a farmer?
Well, we would be here for hours. Yeah, you know, constant mistakes, and perhaps taking too long to learn lessons, but there wasn't a vast network of organic farmers through the 80s and 90s like there is now. There was not an internet that I knew how to use in the 80s and for most of the 90s. So you didn't have this vast YouTube sharing of knowledge. I learned everything the hard way through experience. So now, with you guys being able to get on YouTube to answer your questions with that kind of immediacy, that's extraordinary. And what a privilege, because you know, I'm a few decades older, but those kinds of resources weren't available. I read books, I read journals, so certainly there was information out there, but it was a whole lot slower. So one learned through blood, sweat, and tears. At this point in my career, I can answer questions I have much quicker than I could for many decades doing this. So yeah, there was all kinds of mistakes made, or let's just say things that could have been corrected sooner, but weren't. So live and learn.
Mm-hmm. Live and learn. That's the big take home from it, I guess. That's the last question. So, is there anything you'd like to add? This class is managing a small farm. So, if there's any tips or advice you'd want to give for anyone who'd be listening to it, or my teacher.
Yeah, build the soil. It's our ultimate resource in life. It's the ultimate bank in life. It's truly where capital is consumed, burned. It's the ultimate creative, destructive organism that is an ocean of organisms. NPK is merely a byproduct of a vast, complex web of existence that you and I are all part of. So consider the sacredness of what a farm really is. It's your church.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.